Welcome to Bullpine Legends. Thank you for joining me. So today we've got a really interesting story to share with you. I think we'll start things off by looking at a couple of objects in my collection here. Let's take a look. So what we have here is a turn of the century spur. So this dated from right around 1900. And we've got a half dozen special firearms licenses. And these were given to me by a really good friend of mine who's since passed on. And they belong to his grandmother. Interesting thing about his grandmother is she was a daughter of one Jolly Jack Thornton. And some of you may have heard of him. There's a lost mine story associated with him. And that's who our story today is about. So I think what we'll do is we'll actually go through the life experiences of Jolly Jack Thornton. And they're pretty interesting. And I don't think anybody's really documented where he was or what he accomplished. So he lived a really interesting life. We'll go through that. And then that'll lead us into the lost mine story. And then I'll tell you where I think his lost mine is. And we'll also clear up a couple of unfactual facts about the story. So yeah, stay tuned. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. That's what's going to keep me making more videos. I appreciate it. Need the subscribers, guys. All right, let's get right to it. So Jolly Jack Thornton, he was born John Thornton, but throughout this video, we're just going to refer to him as Jolly Jack because it just flows, it works good, it works easy. But he was born in 1824 in Durham, England, and a little place called Stockton-on-the-Tees. And by the time he was 16 years old, he was working on a collier ship, and for the next 6 years, he kind of bounced around from ship to ship. It was sort of the beginnings of his life at sea. And he made a lot of coastline. He sailed the Spanish Main on a regular basis. He was in Bermuda. He was in Venezuela, up and down the east coast of America. So yeah, he managed to see a lot of country. And probably had some pretty amazing experiences, but unfortunately those aren't documented as well. By 1844, he joined up with the U.S. Navy. The first ship he was assigned to was the Princeton. The Princeton was a steam-powered ship, and it was propeller-driven. And it was actually the first propeller-driven ship in the U.S. Navy. A lot of the other ships at the time that were steam-powered were paddle wheelers, right? So he joined up early in that year, and later in that year, there was actually a pretty significant incident on that ship, an accident on that ship. Basically, they were showing off this new ship, this propeller-driven ship, and they actually had President Tyler on board. And one of the things they were going to do was demonstrate this large naval gun that they had aboard the ship. It was a gun that fired, I think it was a 75-pound shell, so pretty significant back in those days. But the president was downstairs in a bar having a good time. And he wasn't interested in seeing this gun shot. And he said, "Go ahead and do it without me." And, well, the gun exploded, killed several men, injured several more. And it was a pretty big deal. You can look that up on your own. But Jolly Jack was on board for that. During the early part of 1846, he was discharged from the Navy. And it didn't take him long, though. By August of that year, he had rejoined up under the frigate Independence, was sailing underneath the authority of Commodore Shubrick. And they set sail late August that year for the coast of California. They were going to go and assist with the U.S.-Mexican War. It was January 22nd. They arrived in Monterey Bay. And the war was pretty well over. The flag had already been raised, and that was that kind of thing. So he figured he'd better make his way back to the East Coast, his next big gig. So there was a ship called the Savannah, and she was heading back to New York for repairs. And he joined up with that ship and made his way back to the East Coast. Later in 1847, he found himself drafted into the U.S. Coast Survey. And basically that was a forerunner to the Coast Guard. and he spent the next 9 months mapping the coast of the Gulf of Mexico between Florida and Texas. After he had done this for 9 months, he was again discharged. From there, he joined up with the ship, the Raritan, and that ship's job was to sail between Cape Delaware and Chesapeake, looking out for ships that were in distress. So he did that for a short period of time. And then, for whatever reason, sailor's life, I guess, he jumped ship and was on board the Metaphor. And he sailed down to Chile and found himself stationed in Valparaiso, Chile, for a short time as he was making sails and rigging and mending, basically probably working at a port, maintaining and repairing ships as they came in and out, right? While he was working down in the shipyards in Valparaiso, he got word of the California gold strike and the California gold rush. And he decided this might be an opportunity. So he boarded a ship called the Annie Moon of Aberdeen, and he made his way up to San Francisco to join the 49ers. Now, Jolly Jack worked the California gold rush for 9 years solid. There's no record of him owning a claim or staking a claim or anything like that I can find. So it's likely that he worked for other people, but that was how he garnered his vast knowledge of mining and placer mining. And he did that for, like I say, almost 9 years before there was a horrible accident. He was in an adit that caved in. Back then they weren't very good. They didn't know much about shoring and timbering and stuff. And the adit he was in wasn't timbered correctly, and it sloughed and it buried him alive. Now, he was rescued. I haven't been able to find any newspaper accounts of that actually happening, but he was rescued, and he was laid up in bed for almost a full year recovering from this incident. So it was pretty significant. And I think he was kind of done with California. And of course, he heard about the Fraser River gold rush in 1858. It didn't take him long, and he was on a schooner heading for Victoria, British Columbia. And when he landed there, he took a canoe, a large canoe, probably with several others, and they crossed the straits into the Fraser River. But most of the ground was already taken up. Usually by the time you heard about these gold rushes, they're half over kind of thing, right? And he spent a little bit of time there, but not too much. And by September of that year, he found himself going through the Similkameen and the Tulameen. And he actually noted that on the Similkameen River, there was a large group of miners working a bar that had been discovered by the International Boundary Survey crew. And as near as I can tell, this was probably Rich Bar, just between Oroville and Nighthawk on the Similkameen River. It was quite a significant find, and chances are this is the small rush he was talking about. He eventually made his way into Boundary Country. Now, exactly where in Boundary Country, we don't know, but he overwintered there. He might have trapped or who knows what, just made it through the winter kind of thing in a cabin, who knows. But there's no mention of him mining in the Boundary Country at this time, and that's likely due to the time of year it was. It was cold and frozen, so there wasn't much placer mining going on. And this is what he was most familiar with. By the spring of 1860, he was following the Kettle River south from Boundary Country, and he followed all the way down to where it meets the Columbia River, quite near Marcus, Washington. And from here, he traveled west on the Columbia River, and he noted, somewhere between 400 and 600 men working different bars on the Columbia River in this area. Now, this is where he kind of did well for the very first time on his own. So he traveled about 14 miles west of Marcus on the Columbia, and him and 4 other guys staked a claim. It was called the Jolly Jack Bar, fittingly, and they actually had 2 claims. They had that claim, and they had another claim that was only accessible during really low water. Now, it's quite possible that he had already met these 4 gentlemen that he teamed up with, because they were members of the International Survey crew that was surveying the international boundary, or had surveyed the international boundary, and it wouldn't be surprising if he hadn't met these people over on the Similkameen at Rich Bar previously. So he and his partners worked Jolly Jack bar and the other low bar for about 2 years solid, and they did pretty well. They took out close to 1,000 ounces, which is about $4 million worth of gold in today's terms. So it was a pretty significant find they made. And I guess everybody did pretty well. At one point, they employed close to 14 men, and they were able to pay white men $5 a day and Chinese $3 a day, which is pretty good wages at that time. Now, the second bar they had, it just produced really fine gold, and they could still do pretty well in that bar, but only during low water. And it produced about $25 a day per man, which, again, that's 5 times what they were paying people. So that's a pretty good wage too. Interestingly, Jolly Jack actually stated once that he preferred fine gold recovery versus coarse gold recovery. And the reason for this was he found that fine gold paid more consistently because it was just shot right through the gravels. Whereas coarse gold was hit or miss. You might have a good day, you might have a bad day. It just depended on how it went, right? Whereas fine gold could be recovered quite consistently. There's some evidence that in 1861, Jolly Jack was one of many miners who petitioned a letter to the gold commissioner of Rock Creek. I believe his name was Cox. And basically what this letter stated was that the natives on the Columbia River wouldn't allow anyone to explore further north than where the Penderel River met the Columbia. And they suspected there was gold up there, and they wanted to go and explore, but the natives wouldn't let them. So what they were asking for was some sort of an agreement between council and the natives so that they would ensure their safety prospecting. Now, I've been looking for a copy of this letter. I haven't been able to find it yet. But when I do, I'll put up a little short video or a post on it. So look forward to that. Hopefully, we'll see what comes. By 1864, Jolly Jack attended the gold rush to Wild Horse Creek, but again he didn't stick around long because most of the ground was already taken up. But he kind of regretted that later on because he heard a lot of people did really well on that creek. There's even I believe 2 different instances of nuggets over 36 ounces being pulled out of Wild Horse. And, in today's terms, that's 200 grand in your hand just in one pan. That's pretty amazing. Just one nugget. Now, he continued prospecting in the Kootenays for a while. He worked Finley Creek near Windermere for a short time, but he found it was too difficult to recover the gold. There was good gold there, but it was all done by crevicing, which is awful hard gold work. And he moved on to another little creek called Perry Creek. He spent some time there, but really had no great success. I mean, he made a living, obviously. He continued to prospect, but he wasn't having any great success. At one point, he ended up at a place called Fort Shepherd and completely broke down on his luck. And a couple of his friends decided to give him a hand up and grub staked him, and off he went to the Salmon River. Salmon River is now known as the Salmo River, and he managed to stake a pretty nice piece of ground on the Salmon River. He soon employed several men and had put up a wing dam and had pumps and was doing fairly well. And this would have been just northwest of Rosewood Lake Regional Park. Now, being the opportunist that Jolly Jack was, he had these people working for him sluicing the river. He decided there was another opportunity to make some money, and he set up a ferry on the Salmon River. And it was while he was operating this ferry that he met Mr. Edgar Dewdney of the Dewdney Trail. Now, Mr. Dewdney would often camp at Jolly Jack's camp, and he spoke quite highly of Mr. Dewdney. And it would have been really interesting to hear some of the conversations that these 2 gentlemen had. Now, Jolly Jack didn't spend too much time in one place. And by 1867, he found himself on his way back to the coast. And in doing so, he made his way through boundary country. And he ended up camping out with a few gentlemen that had just come off the Cariboo gold rush. And I think they were actually working Boundary Creek somewhere. And their names were, see if I can get this right, George and Bob Hamilton, Cottonwood Smith, Johnny Smith, Hank Kearns, Joe Null, Frank Harvey, and there was 2 others. Anyways, they headed for the coast together. And when they reached Fort Hope, they bought a large canoe. They called it a northern canoe. And they set out for New Westminster. They all managed to find work in New West, and Jolly Jack was working, putting up hay on the Delta. From there, they made their way to Victoria, and that's where they spent their winter. Maybe you just wanted to be a little warmer, I don't know, but I'm sure it was an interesting winter spent in Victoria. I'd like to do a little more research and maybe see if there's any references to them stirring things up in town. Who knows? By 1868, he was on his way back to Boundary Country on his own. I'm not sure if maybe some of the stories that these other gentlemen who had been previously prospecting on Boundary Creek had taken a hold in his mind, and he thought maybe there's an opportunity there. Not really sure, but he spent the next year prospecting around Boundary Creek, and he wasn't overly successful, but I mean, he didn't go broke. He eked out a living, but that was about it. By the spring of 1869, Jolly Jack was heading into Big Bend country. Obviously heard about this country previously when he'd signed that letter to the gold commissioner, and he thought maybe there was an opportunity there. He made his way to a spot on the Columbia River called Wilson's Landing. And while he was here, he ran into a friend that he knew back from the California goldfields. And in 1851, he had happened to lend this gentleman $500. He grub staked him. And the guy headed into South America to do some mining and didn't have any luck and had just basically been knocking about ever since. Now, he didn't have any cash to repay Jolly Jack back with, but he did have a poke of gold with him. And he said, let's sell this poke of gold and I'll split it with you. And Jolly Jack was happy to do so, so they split it. We ended up with $260 a piece. Now, for the next 10 years or so, we don't know a lot about what Jolly Jack was up to. But it seems he was based out of Fort Colville in Washington. And he'd go out on prospecting trips. So he'd get grub staked. He'd go out, prospect for weeks or months at a time, and then make his way back, successful or not. And basically just made a living. He would have had some money coming in from the Navy, from being in the U.S. Navy, but wouldn't have been anything super significant. So he must have done all right with a little bit of prospecting that he was doing. By 1882, we know that Jolly Jack was back on Boundary Creek. And we know this because he was living with a woman by the name of Louise Polly Bosch. And in the fall of that year, she gave birth to the first of their 6 children. And that was John Thornton. By 1887, along came Mary. In 1889, his daughter Caroline. On the 8th of January in 1891, it's recorded that he married Louise in Stevens, Washington, in her father's house. Now, in 1891, there's also a census that records Jolly Jack being 65 years of age and Louise being 29 years of age, which is contrary to most of the records that state she was born in 1865. I'm going to lean towards her being born in 1863. It just kind of makes more sense. The next thing we hear about Jolly Jack is he's operating a placer claim at Norwegian Creek, where he's doing quite well. He's taking out considerable gold. This was noted in a newspaper article we'll put up here. In January 1895, his son Charles was born. So in 1895, January that year, late in January, there's a really interesting article that states that one of Jolly Jack's horses was found dead up on the range above his cabin. It's up above Boundary Creek somewhere. And instead of letting the horse go to waste, he laced the horse with strychnine. And within a couple of days, he had killed 4 nice timber wolves. So this is really a testament as to how he lived out the rest of his life. When the seasons were favorable, he would placer mine, and when the seasons were not, during the winter, for instance, he would trap and trade furs, and that's how he made a living. Unfortunately, in July of 1897, there's an article references that perhaps alcohol had taken its hold on Jolly Jack. And it references him assaulting his wife while under the influence. And he spent at least a month in jail. And they did this to sober him up. And there was actions taken so that he couldn't locally procure liquor. So it's kind of neat. It's basically a reference to how a town is standing behind one of its senior members, right? By 1900, things seemed to take a turn for the better for Jolly Jack. He was attending regular meetings of the South Okanagan and Kettle River Pioneer Association, which was kind of an association that looked after local pioneers. And he was attending their meetings regularly, part of their association. And there's a photograph taken of him in front of his cabin. And it's really the only photograph I've been able to find of Jolly Jack. But he looks to be in pretty good health. Unfortunately, by 1902, Jolly Jack's health was starting to fail him a little bit. The Pioneer Association, which he was part of, decided he might be better off in a retirement home up in Kamloops, live out his final days up there. And one of the other members escorted him on a train all the way to Kamloops, set him up at the retirement home, and got things straightened away. But that didn't last too long. By winter, he was back in his cabin on Boundary Creek. He wasn't content to live up in Kamloops in an old folks' home. Now, for the next few months, the same association he was part of did their best to look after John and care for him, make sure he had what he needed at his little cabin down there on the creek. I'm not sure what his relationship with his wife was like at this time. Maybe not great. Or maybe she just had enough to do with raising the kids. I'm not really sure. April 1st, 1903, Jolly Jack passed away in his cabin on Boundary Creek. And a couple of days later, he was buried just a short distance away from his cabin. And that's pretty well the end of Jolly Jack's life, but it's not the end of his legend. All right, so now on to the interesting part of our story, Jolly Jack's lost mine. So somewhere between 1900 and 1902, Jolly Jack was out prospecting. Now, he had prospected his entire life, and he still intended to prospect as much as he could, just hoping to strike it rich one day, right? But his prospecting trips got a lot shorter and shorter and shorter, until he was down to basically going out on day trips. And late one evening, he was coming back from one of these day trips and burst through the door of his house and exclaimed to his wife that he had finally done it. He had struck it rich. And to prove it, he pulled out a baking powder tin, about the size of a pint, and dumped the contents on the table. And it was filled with coarse gold, coppery-colored nuggets. And he did it. He finally made a really significant strike. I mean, to be able to pull out a baking powder's tin worth of nuggets over the course of one day, plus travel back and forth, right? That's a pretty rich strike he had. Now, I'm guessing that this probably happened in the fall of 1901, because it wasn't long before the snow flew, and this made his strike inaccessible, and that in itself might be a bit of a clue. But he wasn't able to make it back over the winter to his claim, and he never actually staked the claim, just kept it to himself. And he had the intentions of going back one day and not only collecting more gold, but probably staking it properly, right? Unfortunately, by spring of the next year, his health was starting to decline, and he just never made it back. He was able to spend the gold he did find, and that, of course, let others know that he had made a pretty decent strike. But he wouldn't tell anybody where it was. He just kept it to himself. He didn't tell his friends, his family, nobody. And he actually ended up taking the secret of where his lost mine was to the grave with him. And that's the story of Jolly Jack's lost mine. So it's still out there somewhere waiting to be found, right? Now, some people think that they know the location of Jolly Jack's lost mine. One of them was the great historian Bill Barlee. He had a friend that worked a creek within 10 miles of Jolly Jack's cabin, a little creek called Skeff Creek, and he had a placer claim there, and he was pulling out coppery, coarse nuggets from this creek. And Bill surmised that, likely this was the location for Jolly Jack's lost mine. But there was a problem with that, and that was that the Chinese had worked that creek as far back as 1859. So why was it abandoned? And Bill Barley came up with a theory that, perhaps when the Chinese were working on the creek, there was an accident, and one of the Chinese miners was killed. And because a lot of these Chinese miners were quite superstitious, once somebody was killed on the creek, they would just abandon it, up and leave, right? And that's quite possible. Maybe they did abandon the creek and nobody really discovered it up until the 50s. But I have a hard time believing that because it's situated so close to so many small mining towns. Guaranteed somebody was out and about on that creek. So I'd like to propose another theory. So we know the Chinese miners were working Skeff Creek as far back as 1859, and they were really, really good at mining. Like, these guys left no stone unturned. And I think they probably did pretty well on this creek. But unfortunately, at that time, Chinese miners weren't treated very well by white miners, especially white miners out of the USA. Now, Skeff Creek is only a couple of miles from the US-Canada border. So my theory is that sometime in the 1860s, the Chinese miners were driven off Skeff Creek by American miners, if not actually killed. It happened back then. It was a very common thing that if the white miners wanted it, they took it from the Chinese. It's horrible, but that's how it was. I think these miners were, like I say, either driven off or outright killed on the creek. And maybe the white miners were there for some time. Maybe they weren't. Who's to say? Anyways, fast forward 40 years, and Jolly Jack Thornton's on his horse. Maybe he knows about Skeff Creek, and he's going to put his pan in the ground and take out a couple of pans of gold, enough to get himself a bottle or some supper, or who knows, right? And while he's looking around, he finds an old cabin, or remnants of an old cabin. And while he's exploring that old cabin, down in the corner underneath one of the bunks, he spots an old tin. He picks it up, and it just happens to be a tin full of coarse coppery gold nuggets. And perhaps this is Jolly Jack's lost mine. Perhaps it wasn't a mine at all. Perhaps he just got lucky and stumbled on someone's old cache. Anyways, I know it's a bit out there, but it's a different theory, right? And it's not one I've heard before. So it would also explain why Jolly Jack never made it back to his claim, because there really was no claim. Let me know what you think. All right, there's a couple of things I want to address, a couple of facts, if you will, that are out there about this story that we should probably straighten out. So when I went to shoot some footage for this video, I found myself over in Boundary Country, and many times I've driven the highway there, and you look down over the bank and you can see Jolly Jack's cabin. Stood there for years. It's a bit of a landmark for the locals and whatnot. Well, I couldn't find it. And I had a friend with me, and we'd both seen the cabin many, many times before. And we looked for this cabin, and we flew the drone out. Couldn't find it anywhere. What the heck's going on? So that night when I got home, I started doing some research. And I thought, geez, what did I get wrong here? How come I can't find this cabin? Well, it turns out the cabin was moved, apparently to one of the local fairgrounds. But when doing some research, I found an interesting article. Turns out that wasn't Jolly Jack's cabin at all. So according to this article, in May of 1903, there was a gentleman by the name of Charles Webster burnt the cabin to the ground. And Jolly Jack's wife actually put him up on charges, arson charges. And they were stayed because it turns out the guy had title of the property. It was his right to burn this cabin to the ground. And a few years later, he put up another cabin close to where Jolly Jack's cabin was. And this is the cabin that everybody saw driving along the highway. Every time you drive along the highway, you'd see this cabin, derelict cabin down on the flats there. And this is the cabin that you saw. It wasn't actually Jolly Jack's cabin. His cabin was gone a month after he had passed away. So it's kind of interesting that everybody just took this as Jolly Jack's cabin, but he was the locale, I guess, right? Now, another story is that Jolly Jack was buried with a pair of 6-guns, pearl-handled revolvers. Simply not true. He wasn't known to carry a pair of 6-guns. It's never mentioned anywhere, not by friends or family or anyone. It's likely that he carried a revolver. Most miners did. It was probably a 32. It was pretty common back in those days. Maybe a pinfire 32. But he wasn't buried with any 6-shooters or anything like that. And there's no way he would have even been buried with his revolver. It was too valuable. They just didn't do that back then. Times weren't that plentiful, if you will. There's another story that involves Jolly Jack being in a bar in Greenwood in his later years. The exact date, I'm not sure. But a couple of gentlemen began to verbally accost him. Now, this might have been them prodding him to find out where his lost mine was, or might have just been somebody harassing him. Who knows? You know how things get in the bar, right? But apparently Jolly Jack reached down into his boot, pulled out this beautiful dagger, and drove it into the bar in front of him. And that kind of ended the harassment by these other two people. And this dagger was apparently something he picked up while sailing. So it kind of fits the story, right? According to his family, this story is true. No idea what happened to the dagger, though. That'd be a significant piece to have. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this story. Apologize, it's a bit of a long one, but I really think that Jolly Jack's life is worth retelling. And nobody's really done it before. They all focus on his lost mine, and well, I guess there's a chance there's a lost mine out there still, but I think it's already been found. Please remember to like and subscribe. But until the next one, guys, cheers.